Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey everyone, today we're talking to Eric Lobdell at Facebook. He's the Design Systems team lead there. Eric, thanks for being with us on this crazy post-election day. By the time our listeners are hearing this, it is going to be a very different world than the one now. So appreciate you fighting through the existential dread to be here. Welcome.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, no doubt. The hangover is pretty real today. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk a lot about how kind of things have changed from a design systems perspective at Facebook. You guys had one set of systems. You kind of took a look at how that was being adopted and how it needed to change to better meet the needs of your different product teams and how that's kind of evolved over time, and the part you've played in that.
Yeah. Design systems at Facebook certainly are quite interesting. I think it's unlike many other companies. There are just very few, you could name them on your hand, that operate with so many designers and so many engineers on a product that touches so many billions of people. So I feel very fortunate to be able to work on something like this.
Yeah. So what kind of role do you play as the design systems team lead?
As a team lead, my job is to make sure all aspects of what we're working on are functioning together. We have our component library, which is a set of code, and then a team of engineers. And we have our design assets, which we call a sticker sheet, that we maintain for both Figma and Sketch. And these are your typical button, profile photo, etc. And then we also have another arm of work that is our customer service arm and our ease of use experience kind of work. And this includes everything from design system documentation to hosting office hours that people can come attend and receive feedback on using the design system.
So before we dive into the specifics of Facebook, I kind of want to understand a little bit more about how you got here, right? I know you've had experience at a few companies, large and small, that are associated with design systems. Tell me a little bit more about what brought you to Facebook and specifically this role inside of Facebook.
Without going back too far, I think the summary here is that my career as a designer has really revolved around my ability to take designs and ship them in code. And I realized very early on that half of that equation was either learning how to code or getting really close with engineers to make that happen. So I would say quick summary of my career is not as interesting as why I'm in systems. And I think systems is probably the closest a designer will get to engineering without actually writing code.
Right. I think that one of the interesting things about systems in particular is that creation of that rule set, that creation of that idea of what are the governors for a system is, in an essence, kind of like coding.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the fundamentals that I learned very early on when I was designing for web before mobile phones existed was that if I wanted to have any semblance of control over how this thing looked when it was functioning on a computer was to directly modify the CSS and get in the weeds of styling it and defining rule sets that were reusable. So that was the very early stages of systems in my mind, was just learning HTML and CSS.
So you sort of brought this idea of democratization in systems with you at these different roles. And at Facebook, that's no different. You're looking at this massive system across a huge amount of products. Facebook is way more than just Facebook.com, that has a lot of this idea of federation kind of baked into it. Can you talk a little bit about how you guys have organized your design system and thought about it? And maybe kind of from a perspective of what did it look like and how has it evolved?
Absolutely. When I joined Facebook, we had a design system. I was fortunate that a team before me had stood up all of the groundwork. There was a collection of components that were distributed in Sketch, and they were actually a ton of them. You had everything as simple as a button or a text pairing, but you also had more complex elements that would allow you to horizontally scroll through an experience and had transitions baked into that. So when I joined, it was actually this really complex system, and the code was quite fragmented, but they were managing to get by. And then I think as it progressed, as all things progress, right? You need to learn how to evolve to the needs of the people using your system. And I think that's where things get really interesting.
So you basically took this system that had a lot of starting points for you, and then you tried to push it to the next level to be more specific to particular products, to the particular use cases. What was it that really drove that kind of shift in thinking away from what you had to this more federated model that you ended up with?
I think what ends up happening was I was operating the system day to day, and that meant that I was handling inbound requests from people that wanted to use our elements. And I was working with the team closely to continue designing new changes to all of our components. And I think what we ended up realizing was that we were spending way more time than we needed to adding new changes that were being requested to every component on a near daily basis. We were changing button, the most simple element, or something we call a list cell. We were engineering it every week, and it wasn't scaling. At some point, you cannot continue engineering these things. They start to accrue some technical weight that can no longer be as performant in the application. And so we were kind of in a hard place where we want people using our components, but we don't want them changing them. And so we had to do something, right?
Yeah, so you were sort of at this point where the system was propping up this huge amount of technology, and that weight was actually causing the system to break down at some level.
Yeah, exactly. So what we found was, in looking at all of these changes people want to make, we needed a way to track them first, right? And so for a button, for example, you have an icon next to the label, and that's one thing we call an add-on. It was an expected point of deviation within the button. You could put an icon there, and it could be any icon. We didn't really care which icon. So we identified another point of the button that was flexible, which was to the right of the label. And here you can imagine a down caret or a chevron that enables you to make this a drop-down button as opposed to just a button that performs an action. And these were very anticipatable extensions of button that we wanted people to be able to do, but we didn't quite know how to handle if somebody wanted to add a profile photo to it. This was kind of a curveball, something we wouldn't have expected. And so what we did was we enabled people to apply for an override ID. And this gives their engineer kind of a key to the car that allows them to change any aspect of button in any way that they need to, but it allows us as the design systems team to track that change and make that change more useful for us visibly and in code as well.
So that override ID is sort of like this fingerprint to the special snowflake that has been created for any particular product team or app team that needed to build a use case that hadn't been anticipated yet.
Precisely. As we started to track these, we now have comments in code, or we have descriptions of the changes in feedback groups, or we have conversations that have been documented that are associated with that change ID now. And so anytime the system designer, myself or my team, wants to come back to button and create an evolution of it, we have this rich history of why changes were being requested, where they've been made in the product already, how they're performing. You can even look into once you have that ID. And this gives you all kinds of valuable insight that you wouldn't have otherwise had if the team had deviated from your core component.
What does the implementation of that ID look like? Is that just, how is that fingerprint tied to that particular product team or that particular deviation or override?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So at Facebook, we engineer the app on 5 different engineering platforms, and it's all approached slightly differently or unique for each platform. But the premise here is there's an API for every component, and that API allows you to pass in certain things, but it limits other things. Like you can't necessarily pass in a custom corner radius or a custom shadow. The button is kind of fixed in that way. But the first string of the API can allow you to pass in an override ID. And if you do that, it unlocks a series of secret menu items that you can change.
It's like the hidden menu at an In-N-Out or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. You can make this monster button.
Right, animal style button. Anyway, we should hit up In-N-Out for a sponsorship. Anyway, so once you have this unique identifier you're able to pass to this component, this secret menu comes up and you can change a whole lot of things about that experience. But that also has the dual benefit of knowing when that idea is in use so that you can then also look at what people have changed to understand if you need to modify your set of intelligent defaults or create a new evolution to the thing they're modifying.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it any better.
That's awesome. So how do you assess that on a regular basis when you're sitting there and you're looking at all these different change IDs and you're looking at, say, your button, right? And say somebody wants to introduce another state because there's 50 people that have overridden to introduce this new button state. How do you go about evaluating that? And what's the cadence and means that you use for that?
I think a lot of being a systems designer really is just about having the ability to track changes over time and then connecting the dots when necessary. And so for any given change, it's quite likely that it could exist uniquely on its own infinitely, and nobody else ever wants to make that same change. And we don't actually care too much about those. They work against a lot of our values, but they don't inherently help us build a better system.
Right, the true snowflakes, if you will.
Yeah, and the changes that you're speaking to are the ones that actually help us evolve our technology and our design languages. Those ones are special, right? Like those snowflakes are less about snowflakes and they start to look the same. And those, we have a threshold. Effectively, if something would benefit 3 or more teams, it's something that we should consider as part of our core library. And then if it exists on 3 or more separate surfaces and behaves the same way, it's absolutely ripe for consolidation. It should be using the same code at that point. And so that's a very simple way of how we do this. But tactically, we have a spreadsheet where we manage all kinds of tracking, and every component has a number of overrides associated.
So going back then to the transition when you were going from this initial design system to this more systematized process that you have right now, did you just find that large swaths of things were underrepresented or missing from the design system? Was there too much and you had to prune a bunch of things? What did that look like in that transition?
A little bit of both, right? So there were chunks of UI that we were supporting in code and in design that teams just weren't using. And a lot of what we found was that it's not that they weren't using them at all, it's that they weren't using them with the intent that we initially had. And I think design systems often struggle with this. You try to anticipate the needs of teams and you try to get ahead of them so that your code and your components are available when they need them, not after they've already created them. It's kind of a catch-22. Mm-hmm. Pruning the system was absolutely the first thing we could do, but the outcome of pruning it was really just helping us make a more manageable system.
Right. Once you have a slim enough approach to a design system, you can kind of get your arms around it, if you will.
Yeah. And so we had narrowed our system down. I don't know the total count before we had slimmed it down, but we narrowed down to 22 UI elements that we call core. They were pretty basic, as simple as button and profile photo. They really solve multiple problems and they're kind of agnostic of any one situation that you might find yourself in.
Gotcha. So these core components, they ended up being this baseline system, but then you also presumably had a bunch of different teams that needed to extend that core in a particular way. What did you guys do to solve that problem?
This is where things started to get really interesting at Facebook for me. So I'd spent my first year kind of consolidating this core system and helping stand up the documentation that was needed to support it. But what ended up happening was that, like you're saying, teams had needs that we weren't supporting. You can imagine a team that's very focused on a map-oriented experience. That map experience may only be useful for them. So it doesn't hit our threshold of 3 teams needing this thing. Therefore, we weren't really focused on something like that, UI that looked like that.
Right, but that UI still might have millions of users and be a major cornerstone to the strategy of the organization. It just wasn't something that was reusable between a lot of products.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so it's like everything at Facebook has billions of users, which is pretty bananas. But the Maps example is precisely that. There are 2 teams now using this Maps platform, right? And FDS, the Facebook design system, I'll start using that acronym moving forward, never really focused on maps and map experiences and the pins and that whole system of map layering. That just wasn't part of our focus.
Gotcha. So to make that something where the FDS could actually work for those 2 different map teams, what did you do to democratize that? Like how do you put that tool in the hands of those teams and still make it useful beyond just those core 20-something odd UI patterns?
What we ended up doing here is we need other teams to think more like systems designers. That was the real problem. The problem wasn't that they were designing things incorrectly or wrong. It's just that no team besides FDS is uniquely positioned to think holistically about the whole app itself across every team. So what you end up with are a lot of teams focused hyper-specifically on one job to be done, one or two things that they could do really well. That's like marketplace, you buy and sell items, or dating, you're trying to find someone to start kissing. Like all of these teams have their focus, but they don't often zoom out and think about how what they're creating is useful for other teams even.
Yeah, or how it even connects. I assume that creates a lot of fragmentation, especially in a company as big as Facebook, where you have so many different teams and so many different products and like you said, billions of users. How do you create some sort of common thread? And is that core or is that something else?
So that common thread is our primary objective, right? Creating consistency creates better usability, creates less cognitive overload generally. And that's, those are fundamental to system beliefs. But if those are our goals, and we're the only team thinking about that, but we don't necessarily ship the same kinds of products that these other teams are creating, how do we get them to align with those goals, right? That was the challenge. And so I think creating an incentive for them to think more like systems designers started to look like having them own and operate their own design system. Empowering teams to create their own system is actually a very exciting opportunity.
That's really interesting because the idea of design systems is largely about centralization and about this idea that you should have this control point for your different product teams, your different applications. But what you actually found is that democratizing even the design system itself and intentionally introducing a little bit of fragmentation just to have those teams adopt that more systems level thinking was really valuable.
Yeah. So we went out and for a full year almost, I workshopped with every product team at the company and helped them stand up a taxonomy of things, of people problems that their team is uniquely positioned to solve, and help them identify clusters of UI that we call components. Everything that's reusable code, we just kind of call a component, and also identify patterns that are repeatable, reusable, and could be engineered with a single API that enable people to maybe commit entire flows of an experience. And in helping them think through these things and rationalize them, they created sets of standards and principles that were really important for their team's mission.
No, it's awesome that you mentioned that pattern-based approach because one of the things that we learned when we were first starting out with Knapsack is that component libraries are great, and components represent, like you said, those sort of reusable bits and pieces of code or design. But there is this sort of higher level to it, which is how do you actually take a bunch of components and build a journey or create something of value to a user with it? And those patterns are really the thing that are the goal of the system. It's great to have a component library, but if you're not using that component library to do interesting things, there's a lot less value in it. And that's where the patterns kind of come into play.
Right. And I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but if you've ever watched someone that's a teen use an app like TikTok or Snap, basically the way they use it is fundamentally different than the way I've been using it. And everything they do is so quick. It's like it's gesture based and it's repeatable and intuitive because they've learned these behaviors, and they must be consistent throughout the app in order to have the same level of engagement no matter what the focus is.
Yeah, I mean, if Tinder showed nothing else, it was that people want to be able to just have simple gestures in a UI that allow them to very easily and quickly navigate something. And I think that, that design pattern, it wasn't necessarily invented by them, but it was very popularized of like swipe right, swipe left. And I think that seeing those sort of simplistic patterns become really prevalent in our UIs today has shown the need to keep that consistency and speed for, like you said, whatever generation we're on now of teenager.
Yeah, absolutely that. I think bringing it back a little, right, is what we ended up doing here is we taught teams not only how to think a lot like systems designers, but we started to enable this culture, which is the thread that you were asking about. Like, what is the thread that keeps all of these things connected in a system still? It's that we're trying to enable all of Facebook design to feel more like they are the designers of the system. I mean, you can imagine if Facebook published a public-facing website, a lot like Material Design, it would be pretty underwhelming at this point, this far along in our system's journey, to publish the definition of a button one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows, what button should do.
Right. Those aren't the interesting components anymore. Like the interesting stuff is a lot more around like, how does Facebook think about identity, or how does Facebook think about a purchase?
Yeah.
Those broader scale journeys or patterns are a lot more interesting than like, okay, let me show, 25 button variations.
It's exactly that. It's how does Facebook think about creating privacy first experiences, or what does Facebook know about sharing, and what are the nuances, like the nuanced behaviors that we've analyzed probably more than any other company on the planet for mobile app sharing?
Yeah, that's really powerful. And to think about the usefulness of that, both within your different product teams and also with the community at large, like if you can sit there and say like, no, this is the definitive way that you get people to share things, that's a really powerful pattern that goes far beyond just, a card with some variables you can change.
Yeah. And not only would we say like, here's the definitive pattern, I think what we're saying is, here's the right place to start from. I think what we tend to do as designers is we feel like it's our job to change things. But what makes our job a lot easier is just giving someone a place to start from. And so the first question I always have from people, they ask, but if you allow everyone to create a system, wouldn't that just be kind of chaos? And theoretically, you could fall into this, like everyone's doing their own thing and it's kind of chaotic. But what we're finding is that as teams document these standards, other teams are finding them and using them as useful starting points for their jobs to be done.
Yeah, there's almost this culture and community attachment to it. And I think that's a really cool and interesting way of thinking about, like you said, the common thread. Building a culture around systems thinking and around the idea of reuse goes a lot further than basically saying from up on high, here's the design system you need to use. I think that feels probably empowering to those different product teams, and it probably has led to a lot more adoption and buy-in. Would you think that's true?
Yeah, hilariously, I had this slide that when I was doing this roadshow for the introduction of product systems, this federated model we're talking about, I had a slide in there that was my face just basically saying no 100 different times, 100 different ways to all kinds of requests that had come in. And that's because for a long time, maybe the whole first year of my career here or my job at Facebook, was just saying no to the changes that people wanted to make. And it was actually really disheartening, and it was horrible because we're not only preventing people from thinking outside of the box, but we're also just like creating bad relationships.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a common feeling, I think, for a lot of product owners, is when you're in a situation where, the value of your product is predicated on saying no to a whole lot of things. That becomes a bit of a disheartening proposition, and it feels like you're maybe not empowering your users in the right way. And I guess the other side of that too is, the old adage of the one thing you can be assured of when you build a product is that you've built the wrong product.
Sure.
It doesn't allow you to really change it to be the right product based on the feedback from your users.
Yeah, I couldn't align with that more. Facebook app it's changing every day, with or without us. It will always and forever change as long as it's useful for somebody out there. And I think as a systems designer here, you really need to be in a more humble position and less about telling people what they need to be doing, and rather helping them understand why, if we start from a place that is standard and we start to deviate from that, we've at least set up our metrics in a way, our system of measurement in a way where you have a clean test. You know that something works well as a standard, but you've optimized it. And in order to measure that optimization, you first really need to understand how well the standard works for your particular case.
Yeah, and sort of diving a little bit more into measurement, that was something that before the program we talked a bit about, because what we are talking about at the end of the day as this sort of central product owner for FDS, you have to care about the metrics about how people are using it. And that is your barometer, your signal for what needs changed, what needs updated, and how the system should evolve. What does that look like? You talked about setting up basically an entire framework for how you operate your design system.
I mean, that makes it sound much much more sophisticated than it might be, but we have, over the course of my time here, we've realized that there's much more to operating a design system than engineering some components, distributing some stickers, and writing guidelines for how to use them. I think that's the lion's share of the load here, but this thing we don't talk about much is the systems advocacy work and the customer service work that goes into enabling great relationships with other product teams and enabling other teams to feel like they can come to you and help evolve the system when they need to. This kind of work has largely gone unmeasured. And I think that's the bread and butter of most of the daily work we're doing.
Right. There's almost like a product on top of the product where, yeah, you have FDS, which is its productized design system. But then on top of that, you also have this almost like market strategy or marketplace within your other product teams that are your customers. And knowing your customers and gathering data from them and servicing them is a big part of the success of the system.
That's it. I mean, customer service has never been more relevant. I think of all the design avenues you could find yourself in, design systems is the most akin to like having great customer service, operating a great model that is the ease of use, right?
Yeah. So back to measurement real quick. How do you know you're being effective at that operational front or at that adoption level? Or I guess, what do you look at as your signal to know if you're on the right page?
Specifically with all of this customer service stuff, it looks like people are pinging us on chat, 9 to 5. People are posting we have a workplace group. It's a forum where people can post and ask questions, whether it's engineering or design. And we also host office hours. And so operationally, we're doing these things. But what we don't know is what happens after people receive the feedback. We don't know if they're committing to the changes. We don't know if they're going to wholly pivot their designs. So we started introducing ways of measuring that. Simple customer satisfaction surveys.
So there's the surveys, there's these groups, but what gives you data, I guess, is what I'm really curious about here.
Cool. So tactically, how we get into this is if you show up to my office hours and I help you work through a design, it costs us 30 minutes of time. And that's actually quite expensive. If we have a rough estimate of one systems designer at Facebook is supporting over 250 product designers, which is a pretty crazy load. It's a lot like a general practice.
That's a huge ratio.
Sure. Yeah. It's like a general practice doctor or a physician, right? They have so many clients. And so what we didn't know is like, how useful is this time we're spending one-to-one helping people? And so we send out a survey, and we found pretty early on that if I'm to send you a survey and say, hey, Chris, how was that experience? It's kind of unlikely that you're going to give me a straight answer.
Mm-hmm. So was that like a net promoter score style thing?
Right. Like, how likely are you to recommend Eric to your friends? No, kind of. But what I ended up doing was we created a chat bot. And this chat bot would enable me to punch in Chris's name and say, hey, the bot would message you. And so we've detached it from me. And the bot would say, hey, Chris, how was that experience? Was this useful? Like, we ask a lot of questions that are, how useful was your time that you spent? How likely are you to adopt the changes that were recommended? How likely are you to come back to present to FDS new things and new findings? And in this way, surveying, we're able to get better signal on how well we're doing at customer service.
Gotcha. So almost that depersonalization was an important step in data collection, in that people were less likely to respond to Eric in a survey and a lot more likely to respond just generically to a bot.
Yeah, we found that people were way more likely to respond to the bot. And also, I think generally with surveys, the shorter the survey, the better. And so we made this something very brief, like which team member helped you, how long did they spend, what changes did they recommend, free-form answer. Of those changes, will you be adopting any of them? How valuable was this time? 1 to 5 extremely, right? Like 5 being extremely, 0 being not so much.
Gotcha. And so I assume you benchmark all that then.
Yep. And we do a lot of follow-up too. So weeks later, we might follow up with somebody and ask if they actually committed those changes to code. And oftentimes what you'll get is a link back to the diff that they've shipped. And you can see actually in code how the FDS component made it. And oftentimes they might be testing against other things that they had previously done to see if the FDS core component measures more successfully.
That's awesome. So you basically have a really clear idea of who's actually implementing recommendations and changes that you're making in these conversations. So I guess that's a lot like, healthcare outcomes, to continue to stretch our physician analogy a little bit. Like, if if your patients aren't using the emergency room, that's a positive health outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if they're not dialing 911 every week, it's like decreased to 1 week. The fun bit I found here, though, was that the more you help people, the more help they need. It's kind of a little bit of catch-22.
Interesting. So tell me more about that.
Yeah. So in hosting all of these one-on-one help sessions, what ends up happening is I go on vacation for a week and I come back to an inbox of over 100 different people looking for my personalized direct feedback on the designs they've created. And this is certainly something that won't scale. This leads me back to you have to teach the people how to think more like you so that they need less of you in the future. You need to put yourself out of business.
Right. So that curiosity and engagement gets piqued, and then all of a sudden people are looking to you to build confidence or to get feedback on how they're actually thinking about implementation. Or is it a little bit more basic than that, where people are just like, hey, I don't know what I'm doing here, help me out?
I think with systems, you find that more often than not, you develop some senses for product design. And these senses are a little bit more quick because you have the solution book. You know the solution book really well. A lot like the physician, right? They can quickly narrow down your symptoms and tell you, here's likely what's happening. As a systems designer, you can look at the symptoms of the problem that's being shown to you and say, oh, I think if we pull back a little bit, we may have just chosen the wrong UI, or we may be approaching this in a not so simple way. And so we end up answering a lot of product questions that are a lot less about systems design. And I think that's where that reliance on us starts to build. We become a quick and easy critique, right? An easy outlet for feedback.
So do you think that's indicative of some broader change where your team is going from, I guess, a more traditional understanding of product design of hey, I'm a product team that is building an app, and more thinking about how their app fits into the overall Facebook ecosystem? Do you think that's a natural change that they're going through, or do you think that that's something that is, I guess, deeper than that?
I actually wish more people were acutely aware of how their product fits into a larger ecosystem. And I think, putting on my empathy hat a little bit, it's hard at any point in a day when you're working through problems so specific to one area of focus to remember that what you're doing is creating a larger experience that is a whole application.
So that pattern-based thinking is really the impetus for the switch, where people are basically saying, like, I'm going from a product mindset to a systems mindset.
That's the goal. And I think a lot of teams are really starting to champion it. We watched a whole org at the company kind of evolve through thinking like this. And I can't, the systems team can't take credit for this, but a team that was responsible for creating what were groups on the Facebook application, a product where many people could join and find similar interests. And it evolved into something they call community. And the team that was responsible for creating the community UI, the community product system, they quickly realized that community is in all aspects of the product. There's so much more than just the group and how the group is displayed.
That's really interesting. That's a great story. So just shifting gears for a second, you obviously are a big systems thinker. You have this something you focus on every single day, all day long. How does this bleed into your personal life? Like what does this look like in terms of practicing it in your day-to-day that isn't work?
Wow. Unexpected curveball there. What a lovely question. If you asked my partner, she would probably tell you it's really annoying. Everything needs to be in its place and everything has to make sense and stuff has to be perfect all the time. And I'm so rigid with everything. I
have systems for how you do the dishes.
Yeah, quite literally. Everything in my life is very operational. Like, I know when I'm going to do something and how I'm going to do it. I should probably think more about how I should implement this into my real life.
Yeah, what's something interesting that you're working on right now, either inside or outside of work?
Yeah, outside of work, I started tearing apart our kitchen in hopes of doing like a little mini renovation. I had started this before COVID, and I had gotten all the cabinet doors off. And then I had a wood shop I had access to at the time, and I was refinishing all the doors to have fancier frames on them. And I thought that would look really great. And then COVID hits and the wood shop shuts down. And so for the last 8 months, our kitchen has been in total disarray. Most of the cabinets have no doors on them. Half the drawers are painted white, half of them are painted blue. So as a systems designer, you can imagine this is really alarming.
Yeah, this is incongruent.
Yeah. So I finally bit the bullet and I put together a home wood shop in my garage. And I've been, in my free time now, finishing that project. I think the bane of my existence is not being able to finish a project. And so on top of the COVID depression that people are finding, I was absolutely there with them. Like, not being able to finish this killed me.
Yeah, I think that actually that's one of the funny effects of COVID in my life too, because I'm also a completionist about most things, and there is so much little stuff left undone right now that is those nagging thoughts in the back of your mind that I think contribute to the just little bit of downer of lockdown anyway.
Yeah, you really do. The ability to finish something, it was amazing how just the idea that I could finish it was immediately uplifting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hey, it's been a really great conversation. Super interesting to hear more about how you guys think about products, product systems, FDS, and the operational factors associated with managing a design system. Thanks so much for being on the program today. It's been an awesome conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris.
Well, look forward to having another chat sometime soon, and best of luck.
Likewise. Cheers.
That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.